story this week. And I am so excited because this chapter in our story brings us to one of my favorite books of all in the Old Testament, the book of Ruth. Because that book of Ruth is really, ultimately, just an incredible love story. And I am still a sucker for a good love story. And I think if we're honest, all of us are. But this isn't just any sappy old love story like you might find on the cheap novel section in Barnes & Noble. No, this is an incredible love story that goes deep and allows for incredible redemption and transformation because of one of the most incredible examples and combinations of faith and loyalty that we'll ever see. In heroes that we would least expect. You know, as I was thinking about that this week, with all of the emphasis on political hopes and dreams, it really struck me again that God's plan and His ways and means of sometimes providing the most incredible changes and transformations that we need in our society come through some of the most unlikely people. And so, as we enter into this story, I just want to encourage you again that this story took place in one of the darkest times of Israel's history. Right in the middle of those last days of the Judges, we read in the first line of this book. Dark times when people had gone so far again from God's will and God's ways that we see corruption and idolatry seeping into every aspect of society. And yet, in the middle of it all, we find this jewel, this shining story that comes out through the mud of its culture like an incredible surprise in a bright light. And so when we see how God can work in that kind of way, even while the culture around them was doing everything that seemed right in their own eyes, as we saw last week, the story of Samson, I just want to encourage you too to let this story be a shining light for you in the way that we live and direct our hopes and dreams anew. Well, this book is one of only 2 books in the Bible named after a woman. And it's the only book named after a non-Israelite. And that ought to tell you something about the incredible honor and respect that we ought to have and the attention that ought to grab us for this namesake of Ruth, who is the title bearer of this book, even though she's really not the story's main character. Because the book's main character is actually her mother-in-law, the woman named Naomi. Naomi is the one around whom the whole plot revolves. And the heart of that plot really begins with Naomi's coming back home to Bethlehem after more than a decade of absence and lots of things that have happened to her life during that time. And so I'd invite you to turn with me now. I believe it's page 413 on your pew Bibles. And we'll just review the scene of that homecoming. Ruth 1, beginning at verse 19. Where we read, "So the 2 women went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women exclaimed, 'Can this be Naomi?' 'Don't call me Naomi,' she told them. 'Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. So why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me.' And so Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning." Wow. Well, I know a lot of people around here get excited about homecoming weekend. And I know a lot of you often just can't wait for that time to relive those fond memories that you have of younger days, times that were filled with celebration. And maybe you've also had experiences like that when you've gone to family reunions or special occasions where you can't wait to celebrate again and catch up with all those dear loved ones who you haven't seen in such a while. Well, let's just say that this homecoming for Naomi wasn't like that at all. In fact, it was about the farthest kind of happy homecoming you could ever find. And I doubt there's ever been a time with more wide-eyed double takes and hands being brought over people's mouths to cover or somehow hide the surprise and just the overwhelming sense of shock at these people coming into their town. These people coming back to Bethlehem. Because after more than 10 years away, this woman whose name means pleasant, this woman who everyone loved because of her easy, natural smile, and the way that her inner beauty would just naturally shine out of her face. This woman looked anything but pleasant. So much so that the friends who saw her exclaimed with that question, "Can that really be Naomi?" And it's not just because they haven't seen her in such a long time, it's because they really wonder if she could be the same person. And so Naomi makes it easy for them. As she says, "No, don't call me pleasant anymore. That person no longer exists. Call me Mara," which means bitter. Because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I may have been full when I went away, but the Lord has brought me back empty. So yeah, why call me Naomi? What happened? What happened to bring about such a transformation in this woman who they love? Well, the background is summed up in 5 short verses at the opening of the story. A famine struck the land. Apparently, sending in opposing nations and opposing military oppression wasn't the only form of judgment that God used for this nation who kept straying from his ways. And indeed, as we see at the end of Judges, had almost gone to the point of no return. And so God used a famine this time. And that famine became so severe that it compelled many to leave their homeland, to just walk away from the parched land that they owned and cared about and go somewhere for work and food. Anywhere that would have some prospect for a future. And for Naomi and her husband Elimelech, whose name ironically means "my God is my king," or "my God is king," they choose of all places Moab to build their future. Now, why in the world would they choose Moab? Moab was a sworn enemy of Israel from the time that the Israelites made their way from Egypt to claim that promised land. You may remember how King Balak did everything in his power to stop them and curse them, and even tried to enlist the only prophet that he knew, the prophet Balaam, to put a curse on that nation, so that they wouldn't be able to come through his territory on the southeast side of the Dead Sea as they came around. And then one of the first major battles in the book of Judges, you may recall, was that battle where Ehud, the left-handed official, again an unsuspecting leader, came and made a surprising stabbing attack against the fat King Eglon of Moab, after again 18 years of oppression by that wicked nation. But most of all, this nation of Moab was known for its idolatrous and seductive women. Women who were known many times to somehow entrap and snare the men of Israel, to lead them astray and follow their idolatrous ways. Certainly not the kind of place you would want to go to raise 2 young, strapping boys, as Elimelech and Naomi were blessed. And so, in the course of just 10 years, That place that looked like it held some hope. That place that looked like it maybe had some kind of prosperity. Probably because of the economy that they thought they could somehow adapt to. It ended up becoming a place of death. And first Elimelech dies. And perhaps out of the same type of work that he was doing, we don't know, we can only speculate. But whatever it was, it took away their sons as well. And left Naomi grieving and empty. And so it is that eventually when she sees that the curse on her homeland, that curse of famine had been removed, as people again turned to God, she said too, it's time for me to go back home. Back home to Bethlehem, a town which again amazingly is named the House of Bread. A house of bread that God had restored for his people. And so Naomi comes back, but the thing that's so amazing is that as bitter and as empty as she feels, with all of the weight that she has of regrets and debts weighing her down, she was not alone. She was not abandoned. But in fact, she has someone there at her side. This incredible young woman named Ruth, who, as you can see by the artwork here in front of us, stated one of the most surprising and profound and poetic declarations of loyalty and devotion that you'll ever read anywhere. That incredible promise that she made, even though Naomi urged her to go back to her own land, to go back to her own people, somehow, by God's grace, this woman named Ruth recognized something different about Naomi and her God and her people. Somehow a shimmer of truth came through that lifestyle that they had in that family that drew Ruth to say, through the help of the Holy Spirit, that no, I will not go back to my people, but I will stay with you. Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you stay, I will stay. And where your people will be my people, where you die, I will die. And I will be buried there. Because I want your God to be my God. What an amazing miracle. What an amazing sign, again, that you cannot go anywhere where God's Spirit cannot work and change people's hearts to see Him if we are faithful with His truth. Well, you see, that's really the most significant thing of all in this story, and the crucial thing for us to see and catch. If the lower story reality that Naomi is in and that you and I are in today is to ever be transformed by the upper story perspective that this story gives. You see, even with all the wrong decisions that Naomi had made or allowed herself to go along with, even though she had stayed too long in that place of death, God had not abandoned her. And God was at work drawing her back, and in fact had a plan for Naomi to welcome her home. And to also make that home the home for the people around her, within whose influence she had come into play. And all it took was for her to turn around and obey God's voice and come back. You see, He wants to do the same thing for you and I. And for anyone whom the Lord may call, no matter how far away they are from that promised house of bread. You see, this story is really the most incredible story of God's provision and protection for His people that we have after the supply of manna, as the Israelites wandered in the wilderness. It's a story of how God is at work to supply our deepest needs. The bread that we need for life. In the place where He calls us to seek His truth. If we would but obey. If we would but obey boldly how it is that His law and His word continually calls us to live. So if you don't hear anything else this morning, hear this. wherever you are today, whatever mistakes you've made, whatever hopeless reality you find yourself in, however deep your grief may be, it's not too late to turn around. It's not too late to seek your Heavenly Father and to seek the bread that He longs to feed you. Because in fact, there's a storehouse there. A storehouse that could feed us in more ways and provide a richer and deeper life than we could ever even imagine. That's what happens for Naomi. And that's what happens for Ruth too. As she lives out her bold faith, this incredible bold faith that God has given her to take incredible risks out of selfless devotion and care for this woman whom God has put in her path. Now, it may seem that there are no miracles in this story. It may seem that there are no incredible campaigns of warriors with great strength, as these are just ordinary, everyday people. But you see, again, the promise of this story is that the real battle is fought at home. That the most incredible battles and the most transformative battles are fought by just simple acts of obedience. Taking simple, risky steps of faith. And it begins with Ruth going out to say, I'm going to go glean in the fields. Let me do that, Naomi. Let me do that. Even though it brings incredible risk. And so let's go on to read chapter 2. Where we see how God turns around this bleak story. Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side from the clan of Elimelech, a man of standing, whose name was Boaz, which by the way means man of strength. And Ruth the Moabitess said to Naomi, let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I may find favor. So Naomi said to her, go ahead, my daughter. So she went out and began to glean in the fields behind the harvesters. And as it turned out, she found herself working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. And just then Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. The Lord be with you, and the Lord bless you, they called. Boaz asked the foreman of his harvesters, whose young woman is that? And the foreman replied, she's the Moabitess who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters. And she went into the field and has worked steadily from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter. So Boaz approached Ruth and said to her, my daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with my servant girls, and watch the field where the men are harvesting, and follow along after the girls. I've told the men not to touch you. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars that the men have filled. And at this she bowed down with her face to the ground, and she exclaimed, why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner? Boaz replied, I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you have left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done, and may you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. That last verse gives you the perspective that Boaz had. The perspective that you and I also need to have as God blesses us to be a blessing. And in fulfillment of the covenant promise that God made to Abraham for his covenant people, that we indeed would be blessed so that we could be a blessing. You see, Boaz understands that all of the property and all the resources at his disposal are not his alone, but they in fact are a representation of God's blessings that he is called to share. And so he doesn't say, may you richly be rewarded as long as you stick close to me, as long as you allow me to be your sugar daddy. No. He says, may you be richly rewarded for coming under the wings of our God, the God of Israel. I pray that you too may find protection under those wings. And that as you do so, you may live out all of the incredible pictures here of how it is that we're called to live as generous people. People who stop hoarding and who stop thinking only of our own careers and of our own success, but actually look with intentionality to the people that are on the margins, to the people that are struggling, to the people that are weak and vulnerable, and do what we can to provide for them. Taking an interest in our employees, taking an interest in those people that we see on the sidewalks and in the shelters. What an incredible story this is for how it is that we are called to live out all the blessings that God gives us by His grace. But this morning, that's not the main thrust that I want to leave us with. Because as practical as this story is, as much as it has to teach us about all the ways that we are supposed to live as business people, and also as people who are seeking to get out of poverty, beyond all of that practicality, there's an amazing upper story picture in this book that I want to leave you with. As Ruth represents every Gentile person who by God's grace has been given the gift of faith. And as Naomi represents that mother nation of Israel, from which we all owe so much of our truth and our revelation about who that God is that we are drawn to. We get an incredible picture as what happens after this. As Naomi's hope is restored when Ruth comes home with her shawl filled with grain. And even a special message of attention from the kinsman who she meets. As Naomi's hope is transformed at the end of chapter 2, we find out that she gives Ruth this bold, almost audacious command to go and approach her benefactor as a kinsman redeemer and propose marriage. Now that might blow your mind that a Moabite, such a detestable foreigner, could actually approach this Israelite righteous man to be her husband. And it is audacious. It is remarkable. And in fact, it's just amazing that he doesn't slap her or tell her, "Who do you think you are?" Just because you happen to seduce and marry one of my nephews, do you really think that you can claim to now become my bride? But indeed, that's what happens. Because God has provided this incredible picture in His law of how it is that He wants to provide for widows and orphans. That a woman who is left without a husband, without any children to protect her and provide for her, may then approach her nearest kinsman and approach him in a humble way that is not seductive, but represents her humility and her desire to serve by uncovering his feet. In a way, imagine washing his feet, saying that I will serve you if you will protect me. I will enter into a covenant with you if you will provide for me to give me a future. And that's what Ruth does. And Boaz honors her request and sees the beauty in it. And he goes beyond anyone's imagination as to how far he will go to fulfill that request. To become the kinsman redeemer that not only Ruth needs, but that Naomi needs, at great expense of his physical wealth and of his reputation. To bring these people into his home, and indeed into the whole covenant relationship that would go on from there to become the lineage of King David. What an amazing picture. I'm not going to read it with you, but the reason why I share that with you is because it is meant to be a picture for us as Gentiles today who are grafted into this covenant family, that we too have a covenant kinsman redeemer who would go beyond our imagination to allow us to be grafted into this family. That through our lineage, that somehow through the blessings that we have of His Word and of His grace, that our children and our grandchildren, and who knows how many generations after us, might also become specially used in God's kingdom purposes. You see, Jesus Christ fulfills all of the things that we need as a kinsman redeemer. He's a close relative, we're told. As the writer of Hebrews tells us, that he not only took on our flesh, but he took on all of our pains, all of the things that we feel, so that he could actually share in our weaknesses. And as he shares in our weaknesses, he did not succumb to the temptations that we so easily do, but he rose above them. And now, as our great big brother, he can also become our perfect priest, to offer the sacrifice that we need, that is holy, once and for all, to cover our sins. You see, he has the wealth. He has the means to provide what we need to be welcomed into this covenant family. Not because he owns all the grain fields, and because he owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, even though he does. But because he wants to be much more than our physical provider. He wants to be our spiritual provider. The one who could ransom us or redeem us from the debt that we owe because of our sin, the debt and the curse of death. And so this perfect kinsman redeemer this morning invites you. He calls you and says, yes, come to me. Come to me, all you who are weak and heavy laden. All you who are grieving and wondering about whether you could ever have hope again. Come to me, he says, and I will give you rest. As he tells his disciples and all those listening, I am the bread of life. And all who come to me will never be hungry. And indeed, all who come to me and drink will never be thirsty again. Because what we realize when we come to that fountain of living water and that heavenly bread is that the well never runs dry. And the grain fields are never killed by drought. But there is an everlasting supply of grace that we need in the house of bread that began in Bethlehem. What an amazing picture.